This is the American Farmland Owner podcast. I'm Dave Price, where we explore the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities for farmland owners, investors, and those of you thinking you might become one day. This week, water. It's Clay Landry's life, whether he's pondering its wonder as he floats down a river with a cold one, or when he's working with landowners to help them realize the importance of it to their financial future. Clay leads WestWater Research in Boise, Idaho, where he guides water acquisition and development projects large and small. We'll start our conversation about water with why water? Okay, let's start with this. What is it about water? Water is your life, right? It's your professional life, it's your recreational life. There's got to be something about it. What is it?
Yeah, it's a great question.
I'm going to start deep on you. How about that?
Yeah, I find it it is my profession and it's my vocation and avocation. I spend a lot of time on the river fishing and floating. It's a place I go to just sort of disconnect and recharge. Spending time on the river is amazing. But that's sort of touching it, feeling it, being a part of it. But on the professional side of it, water is, there's very few things in our life that water doesn't touch. I mean, even if we think about the food we eat, the power that warms our homes and lights our homes, and then the data that you and I are able to connect over the internet, all of that has and is dependent upon water. And the economic engine that we have in this country is powered by water. And so professionally, just understanding how important water has become, especially to the Western U.S., not just for agriculture, but for all aspects of it. I find that part of it fascinating, and it's a intellectual or mental puzzle to kind of work through. So very different than the floating on the river drinking a beer. The day-to-day activity is trying to think about how do you utilize water in a way, how do we help people acquire the water supplies that they need to move forward with their investments or their economic development projects. All of that to me is, I can't say that I've had very many bad days in the past 25 years of my career. Every day has been interesting. There's always a new challenge. There's always some innovation that's occurring in the space that I've been operating in, which I think is, kept it intellectually interesting. It's not a boring day goes by very often.
Not at all. And you have a national view of things for producers, for farmland owners. Depending on where they are in our country, they may have different types of needs, right? Mm-hmm. And they may have, if you're in California, you may be dealing with statewide requirements about certain things. Other parts of the country, maybe it's not to that point. How do you decide which projects to get involved in? Are there certain types that kind of pique your interest and expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate in that in terms of the consulting business that I've developed with some partners that, we most of the work that we do is in the Western United States, where there's a lot more water scarcity issues. And we have had the luxury of being selective about the projects that we get involved in. It doesn't mean that they all need to be big dollar, high profile type projects. I think, some of the projects that we've worked on have been pretty low profile, kind of connecting to the ag sector. I think, we've worked on projects where we're trying to help make water available for groundwater overdrafting, where farmers have some obligation to recharge those aquifers because they've been so severely depleted. And that we can try to point fingers as who's responsible or who's to blame, but the reality is that we know a lot more about those aquifers today than we did when we first started pumping water from them. And so now there's a need to recharge those aquifers. We've been working with some water users in making that water available so that they can mitigate that groundwater pumping that is occurring, that they need that water for their farm. That's not a high profile project. It's not necessarily big dollar project, but it is something that is interesting in terms of, solving a problem and solving a solution. Maybe taking a breath, but it's not just me at the company. I have a team. We're a very interdisciplinary team, everything from MBAs, economists to water resource engineers. And we just recently got together in Denver for our annual retreat. And I think, and we have old guys like me and a bunch of young people that are very enthusiastic. But the one thing that was very clear from the entire group across the company is that they're all very mission driven and very focused on helping bring solutions to water management and creative solutions to water management. So I think that's probably, the criteria that we look at in terms of how do we get involved in projects. Is it, are we able to offer a solution, and is it a creative one? Then that's something we'll probably take on, as opposed to just completely chasing the dollars. So
when we talk about water scarcity, we've already seen that, and I'm thinking of California, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere, but you have some producers who are changing their whole agricultural purpose, switching from one thing to another that doesn't rely on as much irrigation because they don't have the water to bring in. Is this happening in pockets? Is it primarily just in the West? Are you involved in any of this kind of stuff? How do these? It's almost overwhelming as an outsider to try to think, how are these folks supposed to plan for the future when one of the fundamental things they need, water, is not abundant?
Yeah, I mean, the things that we're definitely seeing and participating in and involved in is some mindful and thoughtful approaches to how do you do more or do the same with less water. And so things that we've certainly been working with landowners and operators to look at, how do you implement irrigation efficiencies on farm? And so making those investments, how do you fund those investments? What are the investments that you need? And what are those that really help you sort of insulate yourself a bit more from that, a lack of available water? Irrigation efficiency alone isn't going to get you there a lot of times. So the other thing that we've been working with landowners and operators on is thinking about how do you secure available water supplies so that during droughts you can call on those supplies. So there's different, we think about things much differently than a traditional water resource engineering firm, which is just looking at the physical side of it. We look at what are those business relationships or those contractual relationships that you can develop out in the market that allow you to have access to water when you need it. So we're looking at dry year leasing agreements and other types of agreements that are focused on either surface or groundwater storage, where you can have a bucket of water in reserve that in those critical years you can call on that. So it's not only looking at how do you insulate yourself on the farm in terms of reducing your need for water. So that could be irrigation efficiency, crop shifting. And, one of the other things that we've been involved in that, is really the low hanging fruit is just better record keeping and irrigation scheduling and monitoring how water is actually being delivered to the field, not just to the farm, but once it's through the farm gate, how is it being delivered to the field? And, ag's in a transition right now. The old ways of doing things are changing, right? And that can be hard for some people and challenging. But we're moving from an era where there was a excess or surplus water. It was easy to kind of let the head gate run a little bit longer than you might normally do today. But having a little tighter control on that irrigation scheduling and a better understanding and measuring and monitoring that. And we've worked with some clients in some pretty water scarce areas where we've helped them realize that if they just do some basic accounting and measurement of water that's going to the field, what they're finding is that they have extra water, that they don't need as much as they thought they historically have needed on the farm. So that's the low-hanging stuff. And I realize it's hard to keep those records. Like, I mean, I have a place here outside of Boise, and we try to keep good records on our place, and it's a flood irrigated place. But if the gate stays open a few extra hours because the irrigator is off doing something else, it just happens. But I think when you're in those really water scarce regions, that moving toward tighter management is just essential on farm. And what I think we're seeing right now is a lot of those farms in that transition, especially when it's those traditional flood irrigated properties in those super scarce water regions. In a lot of other places, especially like in California and the Central Valley, you just don't see flood irrigation anymore for most crops. It's just the investment in technology has been occurring for some time, and all of that's, I shouldn't say all of it, a lot of it has been driven by the lack of availability of water, rising water costs in that region. But I think we're also finding that there's also some pretty significant yield benefits by controlling water and having a little more precise delivery of water to those crops. So it's been a win-win on both sides.
When we talked the other day, one of the things that you said that you try to get across is that you are trying to get people to rethink the way they farm, which can obviously be challenging for a lot of folks. So how do you have that conversation? Is it focused on the finances? Where you're like, hey, look, if you keep a better track of this, you may not actually need to use as much as you think. It's going to save you money in the long run. Like, what's your approach to that? How are you getting folks who are used to doing things a certain way to rethink this idea because of the water challenge?
Yeah, well, I'm a bottom line guy, and I'm assuming most people think about the world the same way. That's not always the case, but yeah, it's definitely sort of approaching it from what are the financial benefits of doing this. And there's sort of two sides of that approach. One is looking at how do you reduce your water costs. That's one thing. So what are the things that you can do to reduce the amount of water supply that you need? So in the event that there's some water shortage, you don't need to go to the market and buy as much. The other side of that is, like, we're in unprecedented times in terms of water management in the West, and also the opportunity for irrigated ag. And there's growing opportunities for farm owners and operators to monetize water off farm through various types of water leasing programs. And that can be pretty scary. A scary proposition if you've been running the farm for a century and this is how the family's been doing it for so long, and now you have to start thinking about how do I make water available to lease to the market. That could be shifting to a less water intensive crop than you've historically grown. It could also mean going to some type of rotational fallowing, where you're drying up portions of the farm on a semi-annual or annual basis, and essentially reducing the amount of farm acreage that you are farming each year. I get that can be like challenging, changes scary, but the economics are extremely compelling in terms of what that means for the farm. While you may be reducing the amount of acreage that you're farming, at the same time, what you should be able to accomplish is you're leasing that water into a higher valued market, and you should be able to accomplish that on a long-term or multi-year contract basis. So essentially what you've done is taken about half the farm and de-risked the revenue associated with that acreage through these water leasing agreements. You've gotten rid of the vagaries and volatility of the commodity market that change from year to year or month to month. That's a known, predictable source of revenue that's coming into the farm. And then you can continue to farm the other part of the acreage and produce your crop as you know, and run the farm as you would any other time. But those water leasing programs that we're starting to see pop up all across the West, I think are creating a lot of opportunity to create a lot more financial certainty for farmland owners all across the Western U.S.
And is it helpful then that as this spreads, it's less scary to people? I would think at the beginning, you may have a little trepidation, not just about the change, but hey, I don't want to hose myself here. I got to make sure that I still have what I need, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think there's some learning definitely that's going on. And part of it is like, you know, the introduction of the water leasing programs is relatively new. There's a lot of caution around those programs, and a lot of it has to do with the legacy of how water has moved off the farm into cities or power plants. And the historical approach has been that the cities come in, buy the water rights, dry up the farm, and transfer the water off into the city for the benefit of the city. These water leasing programs, you know, can include some rotational fallowing, but no, the objective is that no single acre is permanently being dried up, that you're rotating that around. And it doesn't prevent from, you know, doing some, depending on where you are and the opportunity that exists, but from doing, you know, an early season spring hay or doing some type of crop that may require a single irrigation. So you kind of get it wet and get it going, and then reduce the amount of water that you would normally use, and then sell that into the water leasing program. So there's definitely some changes. But I think the days of the buy and dry by the municipalities are over. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of that. You know, there's too much resistance locally, politically, and I don't think it's, you know, I think we've all seen enough of those in this, you know, in our sector to know that that's not necessarily what's good for the land either. So, you know, we're seeing more and more of these water leasing programs that sort of try to thread that needle between making water available for other economic uses while allowing agriculture to persist and thrive, you know, to be more financially resilient than it would otherwise in a, you know, going forward in an era that's likely to be more and more water stressed. So
you've worked on a pretty significant project in central Arizona, right? And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that was, but also what you learned. What do you learn so far from it?
Yeah. So the company's been working with one of the largest wholesale water providers in Arizona. It's the primary wholesale water provider that delivers water to central Arizona. We've been working within that organization to develop renewable water supply to recharge groundwater, to essentially offset groundwater pumping that's occurring to support municipal and residential development in the region. So our job was to go out, buy a bunch of water supplies that allow our client to offset groundwater pumping. So if there's an acre foot pumped out of the ground, there's an acre foot that's put back into the ground, and to try to maintain some health in the groundwater levels. Almost all of the water that we've acquired has been through some market-based approach, some market-based mechanism. So water leasing has been a key part of that, and we've done some water leasing with as a part of that program. We did some pilot water leasing with some farms on the Colorado River. We've also acquired a fair bit of water from the tribes who own a lot of water in Arizona. it is a very unique program in that it's one of the only programs where you have a large scale municipal water provider that's taking this sort of more market-based portfolio approach to addressing water scarcity and water demand needs going forward. It, I think by all measures, the program's been successful. It's been great to be a part of that success. I think the one thing that I've learned from that is, and we've been working on that program and a part of that program for over a decade. And I've seen a lot of changes, and the simple lesson that I've learned is that water's hard. Bottom line, even for a guy like me who's been thinking about it for 30 plus years, water is hard, it's complicated. There are a lot of things that you have to consider in putting these types of deals together. There's not only the financial relationship between buyer and seller, but you have to think about other stakeholders that may have some interest in what's going on, right, and how to address their concerns or needs. And you can spend almost as much time, if not more time, on the stakeholder concerns and needs as negotiating the primary deal. And it's more than just dollars and cents, but it's about making sure that it makes sense for everyone involved, and everyone involved is usually more than just buyer seller.
So how do you handle the politics of this? You may, since you deal with multiple stakeholders, you may have folks who believe that government mandates, government programs, government requirements, that's the way to go. You may have the complete other side of it where they want nothing to do with the government. They don't want the government involved in any way, and they want you to be, it's just you. You figure out what you want to do. It's your land, whatever. I suppose and assume that you have to deal with all sorts of people. So how do you bring all these stakeholders together to find something that works?
Yeah, I think the general approach, I think about rarely do we move forward with a project that becomes so politically controversial. I mean, I think we're managing that risk throughout the transaction. So we certainly have had deals that started out that seemed like they should get across the line, but then they became a political hot potato. And so I think our approach is life's too short. So if there's always more deals to be done. So if it's so politically challenging, let's just cut and run. And let's move on to the next thing. And that's been the general approach. Doesn't mean day one, as soon as that there's a little dust up, that we're moving on to the next deal. But if it gets to a point where it's so protracted in terms of the parties involved, our approach has always been that life's too short. Let's go find something else to do.
Another thing we talked about the other day is that when you're talking about abundant water supply, water scarcity, the droughts that some parts of the country have dealt with, you can look at this as both challenges and opportunities, yet a lot of the conversation tends to be about the challenge and not the opportunity side of this, the solution side of this. Is that changing yet? Do people get how big a deal it is that we're going to have to make some fundamental changes to how we do things to deal with this water supply?
Yeah, I think people are recognizing it. It's a question of who's making the change. So, as long as it's the other guy, I think the opportunity that like it's both an opportunity and challenge. Look, I recognize that as scarcity increases, as we see more demand for water coming into the Western U.S. That means the value of that water is going to is increasing. The cost of that water, the price of that water is going to increase. And that's going to make it more challenging for, those sectors that need to go into the market and buy a little extra water. And so, that can be a challenge, but at the same time, that rising value or that rising cost, if you're someone who has a water supply, doing things today are a lot easier than they have been historically. And one of the things that we're seeing is, yes, my water is worth more. So now I can invest in better irrigation efficiency, better water conservation on farm. I think we're very early days in that realization and that transition, but I think people are recognizing that that's, the change in the marketplace, the rising cost of water, the rising value of water is creating some opportunities for traditional agriculture that didn't exist 20 years ago. When water wasn't worth much, there was no need to invest in the irrigation efficiency. It was also hard for someone who had a relatively low valued asset to go out and borrow to make those kind of investments. So not only was, the economics just weren't there. And today what we're seeing is that as that property changes hands, as there's generational transition, we're seeing the new owners coming in and recognizing the opportunity that exists off farm, the value of that water off farm, and making those kind of investments in the property to improve water management. It's not across the landscape, but it is certainly a trend that we're seeing.
Let's end with this one. Regardless of whether this was your project or somebody else's, what is something that was pretty cool at the end of the day that kind of sticks out to you, or you're like, man, it's a pretty creative solution? And look, if you want to do a humble brag here and it's one of yours, that's cool too. But what is something that sticks out in your mind about something that's showing that it's working?
Yeah, I think so. One of this is a bit of a humble brag, and I'm not the only member of my team was responsible for this. So we do a lot of work. We manage a water portfolio for one of the tribes here in Idaho. And when we started that, there was a lot of mistrust and contention between the tribes and the non-tribal members, the white farming community. And it's Wild West, and it was a bit of cowboys and Indians still at that point in time. And today we were able to bring those two parties together. We started with a very simple 1-year lease, recognized that there was a lot of mistrust. And we've grown that to a long-term lease agreement that supplies very reliable water to a lot of irrigated farm acreage in Idaho. And it also has been an important source of income for the Tribal Water Resources Department that has enabled them to go out and do some things. Again, they've been able to take that income and go invest in better water management on the reservation. And one of the things that they did was use the money to go out and start measuring groundwater quality for drinking on the reservation. They were having a lot of health issues related with potentially contaminated water. And they were able to start addressing that with the revenue that came in from the water leasing program. So I think that's one of those places where there's been a lot of win-win. And it's also one of those examples of where the marketplace actually brought two very divergent, very mistrusting communities together. And we started small, and we've grown that to a very successful financial relationship that's been good for both parties.
You said challenge and opportunity.
Yep.
That could be both all wrapped in one.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Hey, thanks. Appreciate the time.
No problem.
He is Clay Landry, CEO, President, and Principal of WestWater Research in Boise, Idaho. You can learn more about Clay's background by going to our website, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. And while you're there, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, where farmland owners can get their news each week. Again, that's AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. I'm Dave Price. Talk with you next time.